Yes? Oh. So now it's question and answer period. We have a microphone set up back here, so if you can come up and ask your question so that we can all hear it.
Big fuss being made about the addition of the language about the boycott, supporting a boycott by the United Nations, the boycott of Israel by the United Nations or by the United Nations Declaration. In my judgment, except in one respect, that really doesn't change the act. The act exists. To the extent that you're in jeopardy, you could be in jeopardy here as a result of your activities. It wouldn't matter if the amendments were all beaten back and the law was not changed. If the government were to go in, if the executive department were to go in and change the definitions of what is interstate commerce and what is international commerce and make it apply to consumer transactions, you know, the addition of the UN language really wouldn't change much. It's not, because if it's in support of a boycott, just because it happens to be the Arab boycott, unless you are completely, could establish that you are completely free of motivation by the old Arab boycott, the existing Arab boycott, you would still face the jeopardy that you possibly would face if they change those definitions. That's the only exception to that, is the provision about requesting information, which Nancy discussed and which I discussed briefly, which is a major addition to this, which if it were applied to the BDS movement or you all in this room would in fact create probably significant jeopardy. But no, it hasn't been passed, and there's apparently some movement to stop it from passing. I'm just not sure how much difference that would make, because really what's happened here is that people for the first time are focusing on this old act, which nobody really was conscious of.
Can I just speak to the reason for treating it not as something that's passed, but something that's very present as an act before the Congress, is part of a climate not just affecting Israel and Palestine, but the criminalization of dissent in the United States. And that is the concern that I see about this law even coming to pass. I look at it in the context of the laws that were passed in North Dakota, which made criminal what had previously been civil acts of protest and created felonies for behaviors that had been at worst misdemeanors. And the whole process by which dissent under concern for Black Lives Matter, et cetera, has been criminalized, penalties increased, and new laws introduced. This is taking place in that climate. And it is that climate that I feel people of faith need to respond to, and the sooner the better.
I wholly agree with that.
So this is directed.
Wait,
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to chime in. Is this, I can hear myself. Okay. Yeah, and I completely agree. And I don't think we actually, well, with Rosemary, I should say.
No, he's putting it on. Go ahead.
I'm talking into it, that's all I can do. Okay. So, I think just to reiterate the ACLU's position on this, our concern is, again, the stifling of speech. And we do see a distinction between the existing law and the proposed amendment to the law. And from the ACLU's perspective, that's significant because of the free speech implications, the chilling effect, and also effectively criminalizing some speech that should be and has been recognized as clearly protected under the First Amendment.
This question is directed to Nancy and John. John, you made the distinction of organizers of BDS may be, and the idea was more liable than activists, the organizers. Is that an actual distinction that can be made? For instance, if a group works for BDS, does it matter who the organizers are?
Well, I guess what I would say is that if I were if somebody were accused and Nancy and I, or either of us were representing them, I think we would feel quite strongly that the prosecution had no basis given the definitions, the executive department definitions in the act of what constitutes the people who can violate the act, what activities they have to be engaged in. I think really all I was saying was that I think that it is almost inconceivable that somebody on the local level would be prosecuted for, even if they change the definitions. But I think that that anyone who is in this country and who is leading the BDS movement here, and I don't know what level that would be, is somebody that's likely to be targeted. And I think that the definitions may be changed to accomplish that. I don't think they would do the job now, but I think they could accomplish that, and I don't have any doubt that somebody would try to do that.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I apologize for being so late. I came from a coordinating council meeting at the Peace and Justice Center. Otherwise, I would have been here earlier. And I'm so glad it got videotaped so I can watch the whole thing. I'm grateful for the organizers. I agree there's already been a chilling effect. And I feel like we have a responsibility, all of us who are not Palestinian, to speak out against this anti-BDS law, because there's a high risk for Palestinians to speak out in public about it, because then they might not be able to visit family. And that's a reality right now, even though it hasn't even passed. So I'm curious if a shirt like this would become illegal. Anyway, I just want to also reiterate that the fact that they're trying this shows how effective it's been. And I don't have a question, and I apologize for that, but thank you very much.
I'd like to comment to that. First, in terms of how chilling works, whether it's through this law or not, in the last couple of weeks, national leaders of Jewish Voice for Peace were told they could not get on a Lufthansa flight to Israel because of their support for BDS. The flight involved changing planes in Germany. They would have been allowed to fly from the US to Germany, but they would not have been allowed to get on the flight from Germany to Israel. And with respect to what Sue said, one Palestinian representative that we did reach out to ask to speak declined because she was concerned that if she did, and she's an American citizen, born here, and she was concerned that if she spoke here tonight, she would not be allowed to go see her family in Palestine. That's called chilling, folks.
Well, that's really what I was trying to talk about when I was making the distinctions I was making. And that is that I have no idea whether we would win a case based on the old law or the new law if it happens, which I suspect it will. But that people have already felt this chilling effect. I know that I would now be unwilling to put on my Facebook page, everybody go and ask Whole Foods who they're doing business with. I'm using them as an example. But I would already be concerned that I shouldn't put that on my Facebook page, just based on what, if this law passes, because it's requesting the furnishing of information. And it would concern me, and then John would represent me, and maybe we'd be all right. But, you know, the chilling effect is clear. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in this room, unless I'm missing it.
I'd plead you to time served.
Thank you. He'd probably get me locked up just to get rid of me. But, you know, is there anyone here from the Palestinian community in this room?
It's being videotaped. Why would they want to put themselves at risk like that?
Well, that's my point. That's exactly my point. My point is that there isn't anyone, or maybe there's one brave person here, and that's already a chilling effect. Look, John and I represent someone who's doing 65 years for feeding Palestinian children, so we know a lot about what this country can do, and I would be very afraid of this.
Alan raised this delegation a couple weeks ago, the Interfaith Peace Builders delegation, where 5 people were not allowed to board a plane. One of those persons was the former moderator of the Presbyterian Church, Rick Ufford Chase. And he's also part of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that I simply just don't buy things that I know are made in Israel or are from companies that support. And I noticed a lot of people here wearing shoes from Teva, T-E-V-A. Those are made in Israel, and they are very comfortable, I'll grant you, yeah. But they are made in Israel, and they stole the design from a tiny little factory in Palestine.
Thank you. I didn't know that.
Arrest that woman.
Okay, a couple of the people on the panel brought up apartheid. During the BDS movement against South Africa, I mean, this is my ignorance asking for you to help me out here. What lessons did we or could we learn from that experience? I mean, I was in Detroit doing that. I was active. All of our politicians, our judges, you know, our populace constantly was having civil disobedience and going to jail for it to support the anti-apartheid movement. A big leader was Aretha Franklin. She gave millions. So I'm wondering about popular support, and also what some of you may know that I don't know that would help us move forward with this movement based on past experience that was good or bad.
Maybe we have to fill the jails. You know, I mean, I went to jail in 1964 to protest the Chase Manhattan Bank's involvement in apartheid. So, you know, I say that with all seriousness. Sometimes that's what has to happen.
I'd add to that even if it feels like you're buying a Teva sandal and therefore undermining BDS, the boycott movement against South Africa succeeded not because it crippled South Africa economically. It didn't. The boycott movement against South Africa succeeded because it subjected South Africa to worldwide moral opprobrium. And Israel holds itself up as the most moral nation that has ever existed in the history of the world. And the problem it has with BDS is that it is exposing Israel as not being that. It's not worse than other countries. Certainly it serves the interests of the United States. That's why it gets US support. So don't single out Israel as being the world's worst perpetrator of evil. It's not. It's human, like everybody. But the effect of BDS is not the economic effect, it's the moral effect. When you stand up and say, this is immoral and wrong, that's more important than whether or not you buy a pair of Teva sandals.
Hi, my name is Stephen Verchinsky. I'm the chairman of the Green Party of the Albuquerque metropolitan area. And overall concerns that I have, first off, thank you for definitely putting this on. It's good to go out and see. We have had a resolution in the Green Party since 2005. And I was sort of wondering what your take would be with regards to us, for example, opposing industrial revenue bonds by Israeli companies seeking to go ahead and do work here in the state of New Mexico. That would be one which would be actively engaged in. Pardon?
A lot builds a lot of gas stations here, for instance.
So, for example, yes. Okay. But we have the resolution publicly calling for divestment from and boycott of the State of Israel until such time as full individual and collective rights of the Palestinian people are realized. To maximize the effect of Green Party support for divestment and boycott of Israel, the party calls on all civil society institutions and organizations around the world to implement a comprehensive divestment and boycott program. Further, the party calls on all governments to support this program and implement state-level boycotts. The party urges the Campus Greens Network to work in cooperation with other campus organizations to achieve institutional participation in this effort. And the Green Party U.S. National Committee directs the Green Peace Action Committee to encourage the larger anti-war movement to promote the divestment boycott effort. And finally, that the Green Party U.S. National Committee directs the International Committee, which I'll be a member of here shortly, to work with our sister Green parties around the world in implementing an international boycott. Thank you.
All right, any more? What, was there a question?
Yes, whether or not this would implicate us as a party nationally in terms of being under this particular piece of legislation.
You know, I don't think so, but I'll tell you, I think what will happen is that the county attorney or the city attorney would say, if it were an Israeli company trying to do contracting work here, that if you yield to this, then you're violating the act, because that probably would be a clear violation of the act, and that's a real problem.
Okay, thank you.
Not the Green Party, but the county.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, my question is also for the attorneys. My understanding is that the original Carter-era legislation expired sometime during the Clinton administration and has subsequently been folded into the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which also contains some fairly troubling language that has been used at a much more individual and grassroots level to target folks for providing material support to terrorism, as does the Patriot Act since its enactment. My question is, should this legislation actually pass, could it be an opportunity, because it goes so beyond the pale, to make lemonade from lemons and reverse some of the troubling decisions that have effectively allowed some of these material support to terrorism prosecutions, such as Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, to be overturned and to set some better precedent?
I think it would be the reverse. I don't understand how it would help. Maybe I don't understand your question, but
well, both of you have said a number of times throughout the evening that it's unlikely that this particular provision would be used to target individuals and small community organizations. However, material support to terrorism language in these same laws have been used at lower levels to target individuals and small organizations. So could this be an opportunity to set a wider ranging precedent that would reverse some of that language?
I don't see how it would reverse that language. I mean, the statutes that have created the material support to terrorism are totally different from this one. And this is not going to reverse that or reverse humanitarian law. Humanitarian law set a terrible precedent as far as the First Amendment is concerned, from my view. I can't see how this would make any of that better. Maybe I'm missing something.
No, I agree with you, Nancy.
Well, I think one of the things, I mean, I think raising those issues of material support is an important thing to consider. It doesn't really, in my opinion, doesn't really have to do with this act, but since Hamas, for example, has been designated as a terrorist organization by our government, and any material support for Hamas is punishable by very severe penalties, as some of Nancy's and my clients have learned the hard way. If you were involved in this movement and the government came up with a theory that your activities were really intended to support and were supporting the Hamas government in Gaza, then I could see, I mean, we know from our experience that the government will bend the law in pretzels to get convictions under those laws. So,
But it won't be under this.
but it won't be under this law.
It won't be under this statute. It'll be under,
The larger.
that's right,
The larger
7993 or whatever that
presidential
one is, material
directive
support.
that's
right.
renewed annually.
That's
Okay.
where they'll go. And that's another concern that I have that we hadn't really talked about, but that's a real concern. I mean, that's certainly a concern for Palestinians, Palestinian Americans, and another reason why perhaps they're not here, with good reason, because it's too easy to accuse them of really supporting Hamas or Hezbollah or whatever other organization the U.S. wants to say they're supporting.
Thank you.
I'm a lawyer too. I could talk for an hour on this, but I'll restrict myself to one sentence. It is always a mistake to rely on lawyers and courts to protect your rights. You have to do it yourself.
I'm a lawyer too, but I would agree with that statement. And also, I think with Nancy's statement that maybe we have to fill the jails, because we're talking about the chilling effect. And if in fact, and I think it's very important we be informed and know the details exactly of what they're trying to do and where they might determine what the law means. But it's really important that we resist, particularly if it has this absolute chilling effect on Palestinians themselves. But we as non-Palestinians, I think, have a particular duty and responsibility to stand up now. I mean, I think what we're getting from the administration is the shock doctrine, and we're getting about Palestine, we're getting about immigration, we're getting it about criminal justice. And if we're so overwhelmed by that, and if we're chilled by that, then these things will be successful. So I think it's important. Next time, I hope everybody here is wearing our T-shirt that Susan and I and Jim are wearing tonight. But anyway, just to show that we are standing up and that we're not being chilled, and I think that's really the most important thing right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm wondering whether this act could prevent cities from passing socially, ethically responsible banking measures like Seattle's divestment, having to do with DAPL, but at a larger level.
You mean
As
like divesting themselves from fossil fuels?
right, as we're asking our local companies and banks to be selective about how we invest and essentially well, that's my question. Does that make sense? I'm wondering who would be held accountable under this act, and would this act prevent or slow that sort of progress which we're seeing nationally?
Well, I think if you went to a bank and said, we want you to divest from your investments in Israel, and the bank said, okay, we've heard enough, yes, we'll do that, the DOJ would probably be in touch with them the next day.
And so then, as cities, for our local governance, how does that law translate?
I guess, I don't know, it would depend on what the definition of a U.S. person is. and whether it includes cities.
Well, we know it includes corporations. So, right? Right? So, I mean, if I were the city attorney, I would be afraid that it would include cities. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, so actually, I have a question as well, because are we talking about specifically the amendments or the existing law? Because my understanding is the amendments relate specifically to fostering a boycott, by the UN or an intergovernmental organization. So that to me seems like a key element. And it's really that it hinges on that, at least in terms of the amendments and the act itself.
To what's already exists.
Exactly. So that, at least from the ACLU's position, that's sort of the fundamental problem the ACLU has with the act, right? Because it's chilling, or it's very viewpoint specific. It's okay to boycott Palestine, right? But it's not okay to, or some other country. That was probably too political. So that was Eliza talking, not the ACLU, but not Israel. So that's the distinction. But also that it's as part of an intergovernmental organization's fostering of a boycott. And maybe I'm getting too in the weeds on that, but I do think that's significant.
But what about the act as it exists now for a city?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I just wanted to make that distinction.
Well, this raises one thing which I think is a subtle thing, but it's it's very telling, and that is that since this boycott was really instigated by Palestinians, by the Palestinian people and governments, if they were a country, this amendment would not have been needed. Nothing would have been needed because the act already forbids honoring a boycott instigated by a country against a friendly country. But of course they can't admit, nobody can admit, neither Israel nor our government can admit that Palestine is a country. So therefore, we've got to go to this other thing, the UN resolution and whatever.
I'm going to kind of ask a question that I think I've got it right here, unfortunately. But if this should pass, I'm thinking of one of my pensions, my TIAA CREF pension, and I'm thinking of pension funds all over the country, that this interaction, if people like me were to tell my pension fund, I do not want you to invest in any business that is supporting the occupation of the West Bank or the blockade of Gaza, what would be the status of my saying that, and then what would be the status of their saying, if enough of us said it, okay, you're right, we won't do it, or we don't even know if you're right, but enough of our pensioners don't want us to invest in Caterpillar tractors, say, because they're knocking down houses in the West Bank, so okay, we won't. Would TIAA CREF officials find themselves on the way to jail?
The fact that you're asking these questions is a real indication that the people who wrote this act have made their point.
Yes.
And I also want to comment on the fact that J Street, which is very strongly opposed to any boycott of Israel, including BDS, came out very strongly against this act, because even though they oppose almost every position that I espoused here tonight, they recognize this is a step down a slope. We all have already started asking, can I say this? Can I say that? If we don't stop it now, it gets to be too late.
By the way, I've looked at the definitions, and cities, counties, local governments are all U.S. persons.
Always good to look at the law.
Yeah, look at the law.
My question was, as an activist and organizer on the university campus, if there was a movement on the campus, and as you said, the answer to this has probably already been made clear, but if there was enough push to force the university to start divesting and boycotting itself towards companies that are engaged in business that profits off of the occupation of Palestine, would I, as an organizer on campus or would any organizer on campus that might be involved in that also be evicted, as well as the university?
You know, the United Nations Human Rights Council issued a list of companies, they called it a blacklist, in March of 2016, that do business with or that do business in the settlements. And if you were to take that list as a resource, you're in clear violation of the explicit provisions of that act. So you'd have to be very careful where you got your list from.
Under the amendment.
Under the amendment.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted a clarification. It says that these are boycotts called by the UN, the EU, or any other international government organization. Has that happened?
Well, yes, the UN has, which agency is it? I had that.
United Nations Human Rights Council.
It's the Human Rights Council, has, I believe, issued a report in favor of BDS. That's what prompted this.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, so I think just to tie that all together, what Alan was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but I believe what you were talking about was the 2016 resolution of the UN Human Rights Council, which was the instigation for the drafting of the act and these changes. So there's a very clear connection between that particular UN resolution and the motivation for the act, but it not only applies to that resolution, as whoever made that comment correctly pointed out, it also applies to any future resolutions by any international governmental organization. And again, that's the United Nations, that's the European Union, and many others. So it's very far-reaching, but it was motivated and sort of inspired by this 2016 resolution.
I wanted to pick up on a point that Alan made, that there is a tremendous amount of money going into emanating from AIPAC and other organizations like that to the coffers of our senators and representatives. And it is left to their own devices that they're probably going to support this bill. So I want to urge all of you to please pick up a sheet of a letter from Fareed Shakir, of the National Policy Director of ACLU, and please, please, please use some of this language and write to Senator Udall's office, write to Senator Heinrich's office, write to Representative Michelle Lujan Grisham's office, write to Senator Ben Ray Lujan and Stephen Pierce's office, and let them know that you oppose this. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You can just take a lot of the language from the letter from ACLU to these representatives. There are some copies on the front at the entrance, and some copies behind me on the table back there.
I just wanted to make one comment. I think it's really important, no matter what has been said here tonight, that we not live in fear. Yes. We have to act courageously.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, what that gentleman just said pretty much was what I was aiming to say. I apologize, I did miss most of the presentation. But what and certainly what is being proposed is awful. I mean, is wrong and awful and should not happen. And the fear that is being generated is essentially based on a worst case scenario. But we have seen in the past year or two, not only in the support for Bernie, but in the Women's March and many other activist kinds of actions that have taken place, that we have a phenomenal uprising of activism. So if we can let ourselves not be trapped by the worst case scenario of fears, can we postulate best case scenarios and start to keep our hearts open to acting from that place, because we have seen effective change happen from the activism. And I would like to remind us of that, because it's so heartening when we see the activism really making a difference. And remembering that helps me to keep my hopes up in the face of these kinds of circumstances. So I hope that we can all, I'd like to encourage us to keep our hopes up in that regard. And if there's any comments about what is a best case scenario or how to act, not only politically, but just anything that you can encourage in terms of that kind of hope and activism.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then we'll have a few announcements.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the language in the bill is such that expressing support for this while potentially not mentioning like the UN support for the BDS or other international organizations support, does that have any kind of positive implication for a defense legally if you were to be in violation of this were it to be passed? Does that make sense?
What, you mean speaking in support of it, would that violate the act?
No, if you expressed, or you went to Whole Foods and did these things that potentially, based on this amendment, would be in violation of it, but you left out the fact that this is because of the UN or for other, I know that sounds kind of silly, but does there have any implications for defense?
No, it's not silly at all. You know, it's a very, very tricky and odd law, and it has always been, and it's not just because of these amendments. It's always been the law that and the regulations make it quite clear that if you make a business decision to not do business with a company in Israel because their price is higher than their competitors, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, and the regulations say that. If, however, part of your decision in your head is that you seek, you know, in your head you want to support, part of it is you want to support the Arab boycott of Israel, or now, if this passes, the UN boycott of Israel, then you violate the act.
And what if you want to support the boycott of Israel because of your company's ethical choices, but it has, you mentioned that it has nothing to do with, I know that's, again, might sound silly, but is that potentially tenable?
If you could satisfy the government or the jury that your decision was purely your own moral decision, unblemished by the imprecations of people involved in the BDS movement or the Arab world's boycott, and you could satisfy them that it was purely, you were like almost in a vacuum, that would be a complete defense. Yeah.
And I agree, and it does sound silly, doesn't it? But the way that the amendment or the act is drafted, it's about the intent, right? Are you intending to foster, you know, a boycott that's being supported or by the UN or the EU? And I think Nancy's examples just kind of illustrated that. Well, if you go into Whole Foods and say this, it's probably okay. But then if you add this on, maybe it's not. And that's rather ridiculous sounding. Yeah.
One important thing to remember, if you are a criminal defendant or even a civil defendant, truth does not matter. What matters is what evidence makes a jury think. If you think you are going to be okay because you take an action because you studied the law and you stay just on one side, you don't want to be a criminal defendant if you can avoid it. It's sometimes a moral choice to be, but don't go, really, my advice to you is don't go looking to do something because you think you can stay just inside the law and therefore you won't get into trouble. even if you're ultimately found not guilty, you will go through months and perhaps years of hell. There's reasons for doing things, but because you think you're sure, because, well, I know I'm not breaking the law, don't feel safe with that.
And if I may say, that is the ugly chilling effect of this whole thing. If you wanted to find out what a company's business practices were vis-a-vis the Israeli settlements, how would you prove you had not looked at the United Nations list? You know, and how much trouble is, for example, take my poor little pension fund again. How much trouble do they want to get into to prove that they have not violated the law? That's the chilling effect of this wretched proposed law, and why this kind of practice all across, again, not just here, but from Palestine to Standing Rock, this is the chilling effect on dissent and expression of moral choice that we're all coming to live under.
Thank you.
Okay, briefly, because we have to do announcements and then clean up.
If we're going to allow ourselves to be chilled, they win. Right? So instead of us being afraid, I think we should be massing ourselves to Whole Foods and saying, hey, boycott Israeli products and risk going to jail. And if enough of us do it, the jails won't be big enough. They'll detain us outside with little plastic zip bands or whatever. But I just had to add that.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks to everyone. Again, I know we have time for a few announcements. I know that you have an announcement and I have an announcement. So take it away, Benet.
Ellen already announced this, so I'm just going to say it briefly. Ian Burnett was here last spring. He's a Palestinian activist of great integrity. His brother Imad made 5 broken cameras that was nominated for an Academy Award. Some of you might have seen that film. He liked us here so much, and Samia's cooking also, and Samia's company and her great activism, that he's coming back in November. I was messaging with him today. I've never seen him feeling down, honestly, in the 4 years or so that I've been friends with him, but he's down now, and he needs our support. He really does. So when he comes, please come to hear him. If you see that I'm sharing all the time, he's trying to get people to donate, to keep students in university from his village in Berlin. They have to pay to get their children out of Israeli prisons. He's trying to raise money for that. Please donate. He's getting very little response for his calls for internationals, and we're always asking, what can we do, what can we do? And then he calls for our help, and we don't do anything. So we don't know when he's coming because he doesn't have a schedule yet. He doesn't even have his visa. I mean, that's an issue.
I don't know that, I apologize for my ignorance, but I don't know this person's name, and I'm not understanding.
Iyad, I-Y-A-D, Burnett, B-U-R-N-A-T. My name is Benet. When I do find out the information, it'll be on social media. At Albuquerque at jvp.org. I'll have it on social media. I'll have it all over the city like I did the last time he was here. But it's up to people also to help me and share, because I can't do all that myself. And share with your groups. And check out our Facebook page too. We have a Jewish Voice for Peace Facebook page, official Facebook page. And it's not frequented very much. People don't really look at it very much. I'm the only person who posts. So people help me out with that too.
Thank you, Benet. So again, you can get information at Albuquerque at jvp.org and Albuquerque Jewish Voice for Peace Facebook page. I'm going to take the liberty of announcing a workshop that I do to keep your activist self strong. So, you know, these are times that call for strength, and I teach very easy skills that you can use in your everyday life to keep your spirit up and to keep your activism strong. So please take a flyer home with you, or go to notablehealing.com. Any other announcements?
I have no official capacity to announce this, but twice before Reverend William J. Barber II, Reverend William J. Barber, who was the head of the, well, he invented Moral Mondays, but he was the head of the state NAACP in North Carolina. Thank you. And he left that position to to be in charge of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival mass meeting. And having heard him speak twice, I would recommend that everybody go hear him, or you might be sorry you missed him. You may have heard him. He was like one of the I think it was the last speaker before Hillary Clinton at the Democratic Convention. Okay? And so this is Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, August 15th, at Central United Methodist Church, 201 There's four, I didn't see these. So there's a red flyer out there about this. And the program begins at 7:30, the doors open at 7. What is the address? What did you say the address? Address is 201 University Boulevard Northeast. And I happen to know there's only 500 seats, so you don't want to get there at the last minute.
Thank you. Thank you. Lots of good stuff going on. Okay, one more last announcement, then we'll clean up.
The Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice is sponsoring a mayoral candidate forum. It'll be moderated by Tom Dent and Samia Assad. And it's going to be at the North Domingo Baca Community Center, and I don't have that address on me right now. If you want more information, it's September 1st in the evening. And it's you can find more information about it at our website, which is www.abqpeaceandjustice.org. And they are inviting the community, especially the social justice community, to submit questions if you have a question that you want the panel to ask the candidates. So September 1st, the Peace Center is sponsoring a mayoral candidate forum. I think it's called State of the City.
All right. Thank you. Thank you to all of our co-sponsors.
Can I say one thing before we go? It's occurred to me, and I think it's important to emphasize. Now I'm giving legal advice to the room. And that is that in your activities, as you move forward, as you support the boycott, keep in mind and always support the BDS movement, the boycott, and do not care a whit about the UN resolution. Mention it, care about it, rely on it in your addressing people. Just support the BDS movement. And that way, you'll at least, that's one thing you can do to avoid the implications of this act.
Just mention the BDS movement,
Just
not
keep
the
in your
UN.
head, you're supporting the BDS movement. You're not supporting the UN resolution. You're not supporting the Arab boycott. Your activities have nothing to do with that. You are supporting the BDS movement, which predated the UN resolution, and that's what you do. That's what you support. That's what we support.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.